You can force someone to refer to you or refrain from referring to you in different ways. I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun, that's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But if, who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or, using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience when people use the wrong gender labels to them. They've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object, but I do know that we place important demands on one another. I don't know about nature, but I know that fundamentally, like, our society is going to work better if we respect each other, and I think history bears that out. That self-respect and allowing people's self-identification to play a role in that public aspect. We do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns. And that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? Adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage of times when you use a pejorative adjective to describe someone, especially if you believe that they've misbehaved. It's like, if the person can insist upon their pronoun, why can't they insist upon their adjective? And that's another part of this problem with this multiplicative complexity, that it isn't addressed properly within the law. With regards to respect, you said, well, human civilization progresses a lot better if we respect one another, and I actually don't believe that at all. I believe that human civilization progresses and maintains itself when we respect people who've earned respect. You don't just respect everybody randomly. Well, what the hell use is respect if you just respect people randomly? It's like inflating the currency, It's like the Simpsons episode where, Bart gets a trophy because it's every child gets a trophy day. All you do is inflate the currency. Respect is actually limited to that category of people who have earned respect in some manner. So whatever you're talking about with regards to, say, common decency between people, it's not respect. And the definitions actually matter. They matter a lot. And so I hear the respect argument all the time, but you also can't force me to respect you. You might be able to force me to act like I respect you, but you can't force me to respect you. It's just not possible. You could break me, I suppose, and then perhaps I would do it, although I can't see exactly how precisely. But so there's a number of, I get your point, and I'm not trying to denigrate it in any sense. There's a complex issue here, which is, to what degree do you allow individuals to govern the conversation that's had about them in their presence or otherwise. But I would just revert back to my original argument, which is that's a negotiation. It's either a negotiation. You got 3 states. You can negotiate with someone. You can be their slave, or you can be their tyrant. And I would pick negotiation, but as far as I'm concerned, the law right now, as it's currently instantiated, is a tyrant, and it makes people into its slave, and we're going to pay for that. And it's predicated on, hypothetically, on respect and compassion. I don't buy that for a second.
Earlier when you talked about criminality and creativity trends in men peaking at 14, It reminded me of something you said. I think it was Joe Rogan talking about SJWs and kind of and how they create their own chaos, talking about how adolescents have this drive to change the world. And I was wondering if those three, the criminality, creativity, drive to change the world, are linked, and if so, if they manifest differently in men and women, and if they kind of come from the same area.
Well, I think they are linked. But I'm going to concentrate more on the second part of your question. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about something. So I talked to a friend of mine the other day. He's a very, very smart guy, and we've been talking about, well, all the sorts of things that we've been talking about tonight for a long time. And we were talking about the relative evolutionary roles of men and women. This is speculative, obviously. And because our research did indicate, it's tentative research so far, that the SJW sort of equality above all else philosophy is more prevalent among women. It's predicted by the personality factors that are more common among women. So agreeableness and high negative emotion. Primarily agreeableness. But in addition, it's also predicted by being female. And that's interesting because in most of the personality research that I've done, and as far as I know in the literature more broadly speaking, most of the time you can get rid of the attitudinal differences between men and women, or at least reduce them by controlling for personality. So if you take a feminine man and a masculine woman, then, the poles reverse. But that didn't seem to be the case with political correctness. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, because, well, men are bailing out of the humanities like mad, and pretty much out of the universities except for STEM. The women are moving in like mad. And they're also moving into the political sphere like mad. And this is new, right? We've never had this happen before, and we do not know what the significance of it is. It's only 50 years old. And so we were thinking about this. And so I don't know what you think about this proposition, but imagine that historically speaking, it's something like women were responsible for distribution and men were responsible for production. Something like that. And maybe that's only the case really in the tight confines of the immediate family, but that doesn't matter because that's most of the evolutionary landscape for human beings anyways. What the women did was make sure that everybody got enough. Okay, and that seems to me to be one of the things that's driving, at least in part, the SJW demand for equity and equality. It's like, let's make sure everybody has enough. It's like, well, look, fair enough, I mean, you can't argue with that. But there's an antipathy between that and the reality of differential productivity, because people really do differ in their productivity. So, all right, so to answer your question fully, I do think that the rebellious tendency of adolescence is associated both with that criminality spike, especially among men, and with creativity. Yes. I think that the SJW phenomena is different, and I think it is associated, at least in part, with the rise of women to political power. And we don't know what women are like when they have political power because they've never had it. I mean, there's been queens, obviously, and that sort of thing. There's been female authority figures, and females have wielded far more power historically than feminists generally like to admit. But this is a different thing, and we don't know what a truly female political philosophy would be like. But it might be, especially if it's not been well examined and it isn't very sophisticated conceptually. It could easily be, well, let's make sure things are distributed equally. Well, yeah, but sorry, that's just not going to fly.
Do you think in terms of the West with SJWs, and you talked about last lecture as well, creating chaos when there is none, otherwise it'd be static, do you think there would be any validity in saying that in a country like Canada where we're pretty gender equal, is there any merit to thinking SJWs are trying to create chaos even when there arguably is none on a mass level? Obviously there's still problems.
Why would they do that?
Otherwise it would be static. And that drive,
well,
it wouldn't, but I'm just
wondering.
I
read this quote once, and I don't remember who said it. It might have been Robert Heinlein, for crying out loud, science fiction author. That springs to mind, but it probably wasn't. And the proposition was that men tested ideas and that women tested men. And I kind of like that. There's something about that, And now, obviously, it's an overgeneralization, but we also don't know to what degree women test men sheerly through provocation. It's a lot, because if you want to test someone, you don't have a little conversation with them. You poke the hell out of them and you say, okay, I'm going to go after you and see where your weak spots are. And it seems to me that in this constant protest and use of shame and all of that goes along with this sort of radical movement towards egalitarianism, that there's a tremendous amount of provocation. And God, I'm going to say this too, even though I shouldn't. But I don't believe this, but I'm trying to figure it out. You know, I thought it was absolutely comical when 50 Shades of Grey came out. I just thought that was just so insanely comical that at the same time, there's this massive political demand for, like, radical equality and say with regards to sexual behavior, and the fastest selling novel the world had ever seen was S&M Domination, right? It's like, oh well, we know where the unconscious is going with that one, don't we? And sometimes I think, like, because one of the things that I've really tried to puzzle out, and it's not like I believe this, right? I'm just telling you where the edges of my thinking have been going, is that you have this crazy alliance between the feminists and the radical Islamists that I just do not get. It's like the feminists, it's like why they aren't protesting nonstop about Saudi Arabia is just completely beyond me. Like, I do not understand it in the least. And I wonder too, I just wonder bloody well, this is the Freud in me, is that, is there an attraction, you know, is there an attraction that's emerging among the female radicals for that totalitarian male dominance that they've chased out of the West? And I mean, that's a hell of a thing to think, but after all, I am psychoanalytically minded, and I do think things like that. Because, like, I just can see no rational reason for it. The only other rational reason is that, well, the West needs to fall, and so the enemy of my enemy is...
My friend,
exactly. Now, what is it? I got
enemy
that
of
wrong,
my,
but...
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why Islamists tend to vote liberal as well.
Yes, well, so that could be the case. But I'm not going to shake my suspicion about this unconscious balancing, because as the demand for egalitarianism and the eradication of masculinity accelerates, there's going to be a longing in the unconscious for the precise opposite of that, right? The more you scream for equality, the more your unconscious is going to admire dominance. And so, well, that's how you think if you're psychoanalytically minded. And, you know, I'm a great admirer of Freud. He knew a hell of a lot more than people like to think. And so, which is partly why everyone still hates him, even though it's been 100 years since he's, you know, really been around. So, all right, we should stop.